The registration line on Stratum 7 stretched across 3 levels of the docking hall, filled with creatures of every shape and size, and somewhere in the middle of it, carrying a single gray bag, stood Rael Dorn. He was not the tallest thing in that line. He was not the loudest. He did not have armored plating, or a second pair of arms, or eyes that could see heat signatures in the dark. He was a young human male with short dark hair, a worn jacket, and a habit of standing very still in crowded places. He watched the hall the way someone watches a fire, not nervous, not excited, just paying attention. Stratum 7 was the home of the Galactic Academy of Tactical and Survival Sciences. It was built into the upper shell of an orbital station the size of a small city, orbiting a gas giant called Duvrin 9. The station was old, and the Academy older still, and in its long history it had trained officers, scouts, commanders, and survival specialists from dozens of species across the known cluster. It was considered the best. It said so on every wall. Rael read the words on one such wall while the line moved slowly forward. He read them once, nodded slightly, and looked away. Around him, other new cadets were doing what new cadets always do. A pair of Orvithai, insectoid beings with narrow heads and 6-jointed limbs, were comparing their intake documents with the precise, hurried movements of creatures who had prepared extensively. A group of scale cadets, amphibious and wide-shouldered, moved in a loose cluster and spoke in low rhythmic tones. A single Navari floated inside a contained atmospheric shell, its gas form shifting in slow currents, unreadable to anyone who didn't know its species. And there were 2 other humans. Petra, a young woman from one of the outer colony stations, who kept her chin up and her eyes forward. Lind, a broad-shouldered young man who looked like he had grown up doing hard physical work and was not bothered by this at all. They found Rael in the line, recognized the species, and gave each other the small nod that people give when they are glad not to be alone in a strange place. Rael nodded back. Then he went back to watching the hall. The intake desk was staffed by 2 Drethkai officers in gray academy uniforms. The Drethkai were a reptilian species, long-limbed, with flat facial features and pale yellow eyes that moved independently of each other. They were precise, methodical, and completely convinced of the rightness of their own judgment. At the head of the desk stood the one who would matter most, Instructor Vorin. Vorin was senior staff. He had run the Academy's survival training program for 11 years. He had overseen 42 live trial events across 9 different hostile environment locations, with a total cadet count in the hundreds. He knew, he believed, everything worth knowing about how living things behaved under pressure. He had the data to prove it. He looked at Rael Dorn for approximately 2 seconds during the intake check, confirmed the name on the registration, stamped the document, and moved on. There was nothing to look at twice. The welcome briefing took place in the main assembly chamber, a large circular room with tiered seating arranged so that every cadet could see the central platform. Vorin stood at that platform with the ease of someone who had stood there many times before. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He told them what the Academy was. He told them what was expected. He told them about the trial, the final evaluation that would take place at the end of the year, a live survival scenario on a hostile environment moon, no simulations, no safety nets beyond the emergency extraction beacon each cadet would carry. Activating the beacon meant academic failure. It meant removal. It meant the trial was over for that cadet, and everyone in the cluster who mattered would know it. He said this without drama, as if he were describing weather. Then he said something else. He said that the trial was designed to test the survival instincts of each species against their own biological baseline. That it was not a competition between species, but a measure of each individual against what their species was capable of. He said that the Academy had hosted humans before. He said that the results had been, consistently, adequate. The word adequate landed in the room and stayed there. Petra's jaw tightened. Lind looked at the floor for a moment. Rael looked at Vorin. He did not look angry. He looked like he was filing the information away somewhere. In the 4th row of the seating, a Drethkai cadet named Sala watched the 3 humans from the corner of her eye. Sala was ranked first in predictive performance metrics among the incoming class, a score calculated before the year even began, based on entrance assessments, physical data, and species baseline comparisons. She was good and she knew it, not in an arrogant way, simply in the way of a person who had worked very hard and earned the number beside her name. She looked at Rael and noted average height, no distinguishing physical characteristics, relaxed posture suggesting either confidence or inattention, probably the latter. She looked away. 2 rows behind her, a cadet named Bryn was also watching Rael. Bryn was Orvathai, and Orvathai were natural catalogers of threat. It was not a choice. Their nervous system ran a constant background process, like a system scan, rating every new element in the environment. Dangerous. Safe. Unknown. Bryn had walked into the assembly chamber and cataloged every cadet in under 4 minutes. Most had landed cleanly in one category or another. Rael had not. Bryn kept returning to him and kept arriving at the same unsatisfying answer. Insufficient data. He made a note of it. Then he put it aside because there was a briefing to attend. After the formal welcome, cadets were taken on a tour of the station's training levels. Rael walked through it quietly, asking no questions during the group segments. When a training officer demonstrated the atmospheric simulation rooms, used to replicate the conditions of various hostile environments, Rael stopped briefly outside one of the sealed chambers and looked at the environmental readout on the panel beside the door. He looked at it for about 10 seconds, then walked on to catch up with the group. No one noticed. At the end of the day, cadets were assigned quarters and given their schedules for the first month. Rael sat on the edge of his bunk in the small room assigned to him, opened his intake packet, and read every document in it. Not quickly, carefully. He read the trial specifications 3 times. He read the section on Dusk 9, the moon selected for this year's trial, until he had the environmental data in his head. Atmosphere, thin but breathable with basic filtration. Temperature, severe variance between cycles. Terrain, cracked mineral flats, unstable in places, with scattered rock formations. Fauna, listed as hazardous, one apex predator noted, classification Keth Hound. He read the section on the Keth Hound twice. Then he put the packet down, lay back on the bunk, and looked at the ceiling. He was not worried. He was thinking, there is a difference, though from the outside they can look the same. Down the corridor, Vorin was in his office, reviewing the intake files. He paused briefly on Rael Dorn's. Physical assessment, within normal human range. Academic testing, solid, unremarkable. Psychological profiling, stable, low aggression markers, high tolerance indices. Nothing that required a second look. Vorin moved to the next file. High up in the station's command level, Commander Hayes, the Academy's human liaison officer, a woman in her 40s with gray streaked hair and a reputation for saying very little, stood at the observation window and watched the intake cadets making their way through the lower levels below. Admiral Thurek of the Drethkai High Command stood beside her. He had come to observe the intake. It was a political thing, as much as anything else. Humans were a relatively new species in the wider cluster, and there were still conversations being had in important rooms about what exactly they were and what they were capable of. Thurek asked, without much real interest, if any of the human cadets showed promise. Hayes watched the figures below for a moment. Then she said a name. Rael Dorn. Thurek looked at the feed for the cadet she indicated. He saw a young man walking at the back of a group, hands in his pockets, looking at the walls. He asked what was notable about him. Hayes said, not yet, but watch. Thurek assumed she was being diplomatic. The kind of thing a liaison says when the intake from their species is thin. He made a small sound of acknowledgement and moved on to other topics. Rael, unaware he had been looked at by anyone of importance, finished his first day at the academy the same way he had arrived, quietly, without announcement, and with a very clear picture in his head of where he was and what was coming. He slept well that night. Better, it would later be noted, than almost anyone else in the intake class. 7 months is a long time when you are watching for something specific. It is an even longer time when you are watching for something and not sure what it is. Bryn had started keeping notes on Rael Dorn by the end of the 3rd week. Not official notes. Orvathai didn't require an explanation for this kind of thing. It was simply what their nervous system did, the same way a human might drum their fingers without deciding to. But Bryn's notes were more deliberate than instinct. He had flagged Rael as an unknown quantity on intake day, and in the weeks since, the file had not resolved itself. Rael kept doing things that were not quite remarkable enough to report and not quite ordinary enough to dismiss. The low-oxygen endurance drill was the first one Bryn wrote down with any detail. The drill took place in one of the atmospheric simulation chambers in the lower training block. The chamber was set to 62% standard oxygen content, which for most species present produced noticeable physical effects within 15 minutes: slowed cognition, reduced coordination, elevated heart rate. The exercise required cadets to complete a physical task inside the chamber, assembling a navigational relay from components, something that required fine motor control and sequential thinking. The drill was set to end after 30 minutes, or when a cadet's biometric monitor registered a critical threshold, whichever came first. Most cadets finished the task between the 20-minute and 28-minute marks. Several did not finish and were extracted early. Sala completed it in 19 minutes, which was the fastest in the class, and earned a notation in her record. The two other humans, Petra and Lind, finished at 23 and 26 minutes respectively, showing visible strain but completing without extraction. Rail finished in 24 minutes. He walked out of the chamber when the door opened, blinked once in the brighter light of the corridor, and asked a technician if the next rotation had been posted yet. The technician said yes and told him the time. Rail said thank you and walked away. Bryn reviewed the biometric data later. Rail's heart rate had elevated, but less than the average for the group. His cognitive markers had dipped, then stabilized around the 12-minute point, as if his body had adjusted and continued. Bryn wrote, "Human adapts to reduced oxygen faster than baseline predictions suggest, or baseline predictions are incorrect." He underlined the second option and then felt uncertain about the underline and crossed it out. The psychological evaluation came 2 months in. It was considered one of the harder tests in the Academy's curriculum, not for what it required physically, but for what it asked of the mind. Each cadet entered a sensory deprivation chamber. No light, no sound, no environmental feedback of any kind, and remained there for as long as they chose. The Academy's accepted standard for healthy psychological tolerance was 6 hours, after which cadets were encouraged to exit. Remaining past that point was permitted but not required, and most didn't. Most came out between the 4 and 5 hour mark. Bryn lasted 5 hours and 40 minutes. Sala lasted 5 hours and 51 minutes. A scale cadet named Dur came out after 2 hours and 40 minutes and didn't apologize for it. Rail's chamber light stayed dark for 6 hours and 2 minutes. When the technician opened the door, Rail was sitting on the floor of the chamber with his legs crossed and his eyes open. He was not doing anything. He had been doing nothing, in total darkness and silence, for just over 6 hours. He looked at the technician, then at the light in the corridor, and asked if dinner had been served yet. The technician was a Drethkai who had run these evaluations for 4 years. He had seen all kinds of responses to the chamber: cadets who were shaken, cadets who were calm, cadets who came out changed in small ways and needed a few days before they were quite themselves again. He had never had anyone ask about dinner first. He wrote it in his shift report. The report was filed and reviewed by Vorin, who noted Rail's time, compared it to his other scores, found no clear pattern, and moved on. Bryn filed his own note. 6 hours, 2 minutes. Exit condition: voluntary, unprompted. State on exit: calm. No signs of dissociation. No signs of distress. Either very stable or very good at appearing so. Possibly both. He sat with this for a while and then added, or the chamber simply didn't bother him the way it bothers the rest of us. This was the thought he found most difficult to sit with. The sparring rotations ran through the middle of the year, a structured series of interspecies paired assessments designed to measure physical capability and tactical decision-making under pressure. Every cadet fought every other cadet at least once. Species differences were accounted for in the scoring. A smaller cadet who lost to a physically larger one in a close match could still score well, while a dominant physical win against an obviously weaker opponent scored less than might be expected. Rail lost to Sala. This was not a surprise. Sala was faster and more precise, and she had clearly trained for this kind of thing with more dedication than he had. She won cleanly, in 3.5 minutes, and Rail congratulated her without any particular expression, not resentful, not overly gracious, just honest about it. He won his matches against 2 mid-ranked cadets, a scale named Oru and an Orvathai from the second intake cohort. Neither win was dramatic. He was patient in a way that read, to a casual observer, as hesitation. He waited longer than most cadets before committing to a movement, and when he did move, he was efficient but not flashy. He won by not losing more than by beating his opponent, if that makes sense. It made sense to Bren, who watched every match he could. There was one sparring session that Bren almost missed writing about because it seemed so minor in the moment. Rael was matched against a new Vari cadet, one of the gas-form species, whose contained atmospheric shell made physical contact unusual and required adapted rules for the match. In the middle of the session, the new Vari shell emitted a sharp pressure pulse, a defensive mechanism, involuntary, triggered by a misjudged move, that sent a shock wave through the air around them. Several nearby cadets flinched hard. Rael was standing close enough that the pulse hit him fully. His reaction was a single step backward and a slight lowering of his center of gravity. Then he stood back up and continued. Afterward, the training officer marked it as a non-event. Bren marked it as data. The moment that stayed with Bren the longest from those months happened on a plain evening in the common area, with nothing dramatic happening anywhere nearby. He had been working through analysis reports at a corner table when he noticed Rael sitting alone at the far end of the room. Rael had a meal in front of him. He was not eating it. He was staring at the ceiling with the stillness of a creature that has gone somewhere else in its head while leaving its body in the room. Bren watched him for a while, not in a way that called attention, just watching the way the Orvithai do, continuously and quietly. 40 minutes passed. Rael did not move. He was not sleeping. His eyes were open and occasionally they tracked something, as if following a slow movement that only he could see. Eventually Bren walked over and asked, with the directness that Orvithai applied to most things, if Rael was all right. Rael looked at him. He seemed unsurprised to find Bren there. He said he was fine. Bren asked what he was thinking about. Rael said, the moon. Bren understood which moon he meant. Dusk 9. The trial location. It had not been officially announced yet. The broad details had been shared at intake, that the trial would take place on a hostile environment moon, that it would be 14 days, that it would be real. But the specific designation of Dusk 9 as this year's site had not been posted publicly. Bren asked how Rael knew it was Dusk 9. Rael said, I looked at the simulation chamber rotations. The environmental presets have been running Dusk 9 parameters for the last 6 weeks. Someone is preparing the equipment. Bren had not noticed this. He was ranked second in the class in analytical performance. He had not noticed this. He sat with that for a moment and then asked what Rael had concluded about the moon. Rael said, it's going to be cold at night. Colder than the specs say, because the orbital position this time of year increases the variance, and the ground near the mineral flats will be unstable. Seismic activity, the kind that doesn't show up as dramatic but causes problems if you're not already thinking about footing. He picked up his meal, which had gone cold, and ate it without complaint. Bren went back to his table and opened a new file. He did not know what to title it. He wrote the date at the top and Rael's name, and then he wrote, I think I have been measuring the wrong things. Up on the command level, Vorin was doing the final planning for the trial. He was pleased with the additions he had made to this year's scenario. The Keth Hound was a real touch, a live animal, not a drone, not a simulation. Real instinct, real unpredictability. He had specifically selected a mature male from a breeding facility that worked with the academy on training scenarios. The animal was large, experienced, and genuinely dangerous. He expected it to provide the class with a meaningful encounter. He expected most cadets to do the right thing and avoid it. He reviewed the intake class rankings one more time. Sala first, Bren second, then a run of Drethkai and Orvithai cadets, capable and well-prepared. Then the humans, Petra at 9th, Lind at 11th, Rael at 14th. 14th. He looked at the name for a moment. There was nothing in the file that demanded attention. The file was the problem, in a way. It was too clean, too middle, too consistently unremarkable. But that was, Vorin reminded himself, because there was nothing remarkable there. Some cadets simply were not remarkable. That was what the data showed. He approved the trial parameters and sent the confirmation. The date was set. Dusk 9 was waiting. Rael, in his quarters that evening, had the trial packet open again. He was reading the section on the Keth Hound for the 5th time since intake. He knew its hunting patterns, its territorial range, its sensory strengths and weaknesses. He knew that it used vibration to track movement, that it was most active in the temperature drop between the day and night cycles, that it was intelligent in the way that apex predators are intelligent, not learning the way people do, but calculating in the way that comes from being the last thing standing in a very hard place for a very long time. He understood that, more than most things in the trial briefing documents, the Kethhound had been put there by someone who thought it would be the thing that scared people most. He closed the packet. He thought about the moon a while longer. Then he turned off the light and went to sleep, and if he had any dreams that night, no one ever asked him about them. The drop capsules hit the atmosphere of Dusk 9 in a staggered sequence, each one carrying a single cadet and a single pack. And for about 40 seconds after the capsule opened and the chute deployed, every cadet in the trial was alone with the sky. It was not a kind sky. It was pale and thin, the color of old bone, and the light that came through it was flat and directionless, the kind of light that makes distances hard to read. Below, the surface of Dusk 9 stretched out in every direction. Vast cracked plains of dark mineral rock, interrupted here and there by low ridge lines and shallow channels carved by ancient water that no longer ran anywhere. The air moved constantly, not wind exactly, more like pressure, the atmosphere pushed around by the thermal shifts between the planet's surface and the cold above it. It tasted, for those species that could taste it, of iron and old stone. Rail's capsule came down on the eastern edge of a flat stretch, close enough to a ridgeline that he had a natural reference point the moment he landed. He was on his feet before the chute had fully settled. He unclipped the harness, folded it, habit, because a loose chute creates noise, and looked around. He turned slowly and took in the full circle of his surroundings. He noted the ridgeline to his west. He noted the direction of the pressure wind, which was coming from the north. He noted the way the cracked ground had different colors in different areas, some sections darker, heavier with mineral content, more likely to be solid, others lighter and more fractured, less trustworthy underfoot. He noted all of this in approximately 90 seconds. Then he shouldered his pack and started walking toward the coordinates where the group consolidation was expected. He found Sala first, which surprised her. She had landed 2 kilometers to his north and had been moving efficiently toward the consolidation point when Rail appeared from the south, walking at a pace that looked easy, not rushed, not slow. They acknowledged each other with the brief, practical greeting of people who have more important things to assess than their feelings about each other's company. They checked coordinates. They confirmed they were moving in the right direction. Bren arrived 7 minutes later from the east, and the scale cadet, Dur, came in from the northwest, the last of the 4, half an hour after that. Sala took command of the group immediately. This was reasonable, and none of the others contested it. She was ranked first in the class. She had a structured approach and a clear head, and she began organizing before anyone suggested it, which is the mark of someone who actually knows what they are doing. She assigned roles for the march to the campsite she had already selected from the terrain data in her pre-trial briefing pack. Rail asked one question during this process. He asked which direction the pressure wind was coming from. Sala told him, north. He nodded and did not ask anything else. They moved as a group through the flat stretch of mineral plain, keeping to the darker ground where the footing was better. The light was still flat and pale, and the temperature was already lower than the orbital data had predicted, which Rail noted internally and filed away without mentioning. The variance in temperature between the day and night cycles on Dusk 9 was listed in the trial documentation as approximately 40 degrees. He suspected it was higher than that. The way the air felt at this hour, with the planet still in its mid-cycle, suggested the night drop would be severe. They reached the campsite Sala had selected, a shallow bowl in the rock, backed by a natural windbreak of stacked mineral formation, with a clear sight line across the flat in 3 directions. It was a good choice. Sala began assigning tasks before they had fully arrived. Dur was given perimeter assessment, Bryn was on supply cataloging, Rail was given camp establishment, which meant organizing the sleeping area and the basic shelter framing. This was the second least prestigious task available. Rail took it without comment and did it thoroughly. They were not quite finished when the ground moved. It was a small seismic event by any objective measure. A tremor, not an earthquake, the kind that would not register on most standard monitoring systems and would not have been mentioned if anyone had been telling a story about the geology of Dusk 9. But they were not on a monitoring system. They were on the ground. And on the ground, even a small seismic event becomes very real very quickly, especially on terrain like this, where the surface was already fractured and some of it was more hollow below than it looked from above. The group had been crossing a section of lighter-colored rock to reach a secondary supply drop point marked on Bryn's map. The tremor ran through the ground in a wave that lasted approximately 3 seconds. On solid ground, 3 seconds is nothing. On fractured hollow mineral crust, 3 seconds is enough. The section beneath Bryn gave way. It was not a catastrophic collapse. The opening was narrow, wide enough for one limb, which was exactly what went in. Bryn's left front leg, the longer of his lower pair, dropped through the crust as it cracked, and the edges of the new gap caught him at the joint above the knee. His exoskeleton absorbed some of the pressure, which was the only reason it was not immediately worse. He went down hard, caught himself with his upper limbs, and was still. The correct response when trapped in fractured terrain, because movement creates more movement. Sala moved to the edge of the break immediately and began assessing the situation with the efficiency she brought to everything. She called out measurements, looked at the angle of Bryn's trapped limb, calculated the structural stress on the surrounding crust, and began laying out a plan. She was going to need them to brace at 2 points on the east side, one to the west, and create a controlled uplift pressure while Bryn rotated his leg to clear the edge. It was a good plan. Clear, logical, methodical. It was going to take about 30 minutes. Rail was already in the fissure. He had gone over the edge on the opposite side from Bryn's trapped limb, finding a wider section of the crack that could take his weight, and he was now positioned below the surface level, one hand against the underside of the crust for stability, the other working at the debris that had fallen around Bryn's leg and was adding to the compression. He moved pieces systematically, not fast, not reckless, deliberately, the way someone moves things when they understand that the wrong move makes it worse and the right move makes it simple. He did not ask Bryn if he was all right. Bryn was not all right, and they both knew it, and asking would have used time that could be used for something else. Sala looked at what Rail was doing. She almost called him back, because her plan was already in motion in her head, and an unknown variable in the fissure complicated it. She did not call him back because she looked at how he was moving and recognized, with the honesty that made her a good leader, that he was doing something that was working. 11 minutes. That was how long it took. 11 minutes after the tremor, Bryn's leg came free. There was damage to the joint casing, a crack in the exoskeleton that would limit his mobility for the rest of the trial. But the limb was intact, and his movement was not critical. He pulled himself back onto solid ground with his upper limbs and lay still for a moment while his body caught up with what had just happened. Rail climbed out of the fissure. There was mineral dust on his jacket and a scrape on the back of one hand. He looked at Bryn's leg with a brief clinical look, decided it was not immediately his problem to solve in this moment, and looked at Sala to see what came next. Sala was looking at him. She asked how he had known what to do. Rail said he hadn't known. He had just started. Sala did not have a good response to that, so she said nothing and returned to camp planning, which was the right thing to do. But the words stayed with her for a while. She kept turning them over. She had been trained to plan before acting. The Academy taught it. Species survival theory supported it. Planning before action reduces error. And yet Rail had been 11 minutes faster than her plan, without a plan. She filed it under instinct. Non-methodical response. She moved on. Bryn lay on the prepared ground of the campsite, while Dur applied basic joint sealing from the medical kit. He had been thinking about those 11 minutes. He had felt Rail moving below him in the fissure, felt the methodical removal of each piece of debris, felt the pressure changing incrementally, understood from the quality of the movement that the person doing it was not guessing. Whatever Rail had done, it had not been random. It had been ordered, just ordered in a way that happened faster than planning allows. Bryn opened his data log and made the first field entry of the trial. He wrote, Day 1. Seismic event at the secondary supply point. Cadet Rail Dorn entered a fissure immediately following ground collapse and freed trapped Orvithai cadet in 11 minutes. No prior consultation, no stated methodology. Result, effective. Query for follow-up. What is the relationship between the human survival response and the gap between decision and action? Observation. The gap appears to be very small, possibly smaller than any baseline I have a comparison for. He closed the log. His leg ached where the exoskeleton had cracked, Outside the campsite's rock shelter, the day cycle was winding down. The flat pale light was going gray at the edges. And then, from somewhere out in that gray distance, the sound came. It was not a howl. Nothing so clean. It was a low, resonant sound, structured in a way that suggested intention. Not random noise, but something deliberate, the kind of call that carries information between creatures that understand each other. It moved across the flat plain without an echo, absorbed by the cracked ground, and arrived at the campsite as a feeling more than a sound. A pressure in the chest, something below the frequency that language uses. Dur pressed closer to the rock wall. Sala's hand moved to her data log, and she opened it to record the auditory signature, which was the correct thing to do and also gave her something to look at. Bryn went very still, which was Orvathai threat response, and watched the darkness in the direction of the sound. Rail was on watch. He was sitting at the edge of the shelter's sight line, which was where the watch position was, and he turned his head toward the sound when it came. He looked in that direction for a long time. His expression was not frightened. It was not excited. It was the expression of someone who is hearing something they have already thought about and are now simply locating in the world for the first time. Bryn watched Rail's face and later, in his field log, tried 3 different words for the expression before settling on one. He wrote, focused, not fear, not aggression, something that sits between those two things and is older than either of them. He didn't write anything else about it that night. The Keth hound did not come closer. The temperature dropped 47 degrees between the end of the day cycle and the first hour of night, which was 7 more degrees than the trial documentation had predicted. Rail had already accounted for 7. By day 3, 3 cadets from other groups had activated their beacons. The Academy tracking station on Stratum 7 logged each signal with the quiet efficiency of a system that had done this many times before. Extraction shuttles went down. Cadets came up. The trial continued without them, the way water continues past a stone. Up in the orbital observation deck, Admiral Thurek watched the trial data with the attention of someone who had requested this posting personally and was beginning to wonder if it was as interesting as he had hoped. He reviewed the active biometric feeds, the terrain mapping, the group positioning reports. He was looking for patterns. He found several that matched his predictions. The top-ranked cadets were performing well, the lower-ranked ones were struggling. The hostile environment was revealing gaps between theoretical scores and real-world results in ways that were cleanly logical. His attention moved across the feeds, paused briefly on the group containing Sala, then moved to Rail Dorn's individual data and stopped. He looked at it for a moment. Then he called Commander Hayes to the observation deck. Hayes arrived in the unhurried way that she did most things and stood beside him at the display. Thurek pointed at Rail's biometric feed. The stress indicators, the cortisol-equivalent hormones the Academy's medical system monitored remotely through the cadet's tracker, the heart rate data, the sleep quality markers from the previous 2 nights, were all running at a level that, according to the baseline established during the Academy year, was below what Rail showed during routine training. Thurek said, "He is calmer now than he was in the classroom." Hayes looked at the data. She said, "Yes." Thurek said, "Is there a malfunction in the sensor?" Hayes said, "No." Thurek looked at her. He asked what it meant. Hayes was quiet for a moment, the way she was quiet before saying something she had considered carefully. Then she said, "There are humans for whom dangerous environments are not stressful in the way the model predicts. The stress response is present, but it does not accumulate. It moves through them and exits. In a controlled environment like the Academy, the ordinary accumulation of social pressure, performance metrics, ambient noise, the sense of being assessed constantly, that produces more sustained stress than a situation the body recognizes as a real problem." Thurek said, "Recognized as a real problem." Hayes said, "Humans evolved in a real environment, not a structured one. The nervous system knows the difference between the threat of a bad score and the threat of a cold night on bad ground. One of those it was built for." Thurek looked back at the display. He thought about what she was saying. He was not sure he believed it. Not completely, but the data was what it was. He moved on to other feeds and other concerns, and Hayes remained at the display for a while longer, watching Rail's numbers with the expression of someone watching a thing they knew about and were glad to see confirmed. On day 5, the Keth hound found the camp. It had been circling the group's territory since day 2, based on the sound signatures Bryn had been logging. It moved in a pattern that was not random, The Keth Hound was establishing range, measuring the group, deciding what they were. This was what the species did. They did not rush. They were patient in the way that came from being very good at their job in a very empty landscape, where patience costs nothing and haste sometimes costs everything. On the fifth night, it came close. The camp was in its usual configuration, the three of them arranged inside the rock shelter with the open side facing the flat plain. Rail was on watch. The night was at its coldest. The flat black of dusk night sky punched through with unfamiliar stars, the temperature sitting at a level that made the inside of the lungs feel brittle. The Keth Hound came out of the dark slowly. It was large, larger than the documentation had implied, or perhaps documentation simply failed to communicate the reality of a creature like that standing in open ground 30 meters away. Its body was low and long, built for cover even in landscape that offered very little of it. Its eyes caught the faint ambient light and gave nothing back. It stopped when it reached the edge of the campsite line, and it looked at Rail. And Rail looked at it. Bryn woke at the slight change in the air. Orvathai slept lightly in unfamiliar environments, one of the species' more useful characteristics, and saw the animal at the perimeter. He did not move. He understood immediately that moving was the wrong answer. He watched instead. The Keth Hound's assessment posture was clear to Bryn's pattern recognition. It was reading the camp, cataloging the elements, deciding if this group was prey, competitor, or something else. It had three options available to it in this moment: attack, retreat, or continue monitoring. Its body language suggested it had not yet decided. Rail picked up a rock. It was not a large rock. It was a piece of the mineral formation that had been sitting near his foot since he took the watch position. He picked it up the way someone picks up something they have already decided to use, without the delay of deliberation, and threw it at the Keth Hound. Hard, direct. It struck the animal on the flank with a sound that was sharp and clear in the cold air. The Keth Hound's response was immediate. It froze. Not retreated. Not attacked. Froze. The thing had just been struck by a thrown object, and instead of triggering flight or fight, it had been confused. Bryn noted this with the part of his brain that was always taking notes. The Keth Hound was recalibrating. Then Rail picked up a second rock. He did not throw it. He held it and looked at the animal. His posture did not change. He was not making himself larger. He was not performing aggression. He was not doing any of the things that survival guides across multiple species recommended when facing apex predators. He was just standing, holding a rock, looking at the Keth Hound with the same focused quiet he had been using since the first sound of it on night 1. 1 minute and 40 seconds passed. Bryn counted them. He watched the animal. He watched Rail. He watched the space between them, which was full of something he didn't have a technical term for. The Keth Hound retreated. Not fast. It moved the way it had arrived, without urgency, with the dignity of a thing that chooses its direction rather than being pushed. It moved back into the dark, and the sound of it faded. Rail set the second rock down. He did not watch where the hound went. He turned back to his watch position and resumed scanning the flat plain. Bryn lay still for a long time. He opened his data log and wrote, Day 5, night. Keth Hound contact at camp perimeter. Cadet Rail Dorn responded by throwing a stone at the animal. The animal froze, then retreated after a sustained visual exchange of 1 minute and 40 seconds. I have reviewed my knowledge base on the Keth Hound. I have studied 7 apex predator species across 4 systems. None of them, in documented encounters, retreat from a single organism that has demonstrated no lethal capability. The hound assessed Rail for 1 minute and 40 seconds and decided against engagement. I do not know what assessment it made. I am not certain I want to. He paused for a long time over the log before writing the last line. I think the animal was afraid. On day 6, Sala cracked her filtration mask. It happened during a scramble across broken ground, a section of the terrain that had shifted slightly in a secondary tremor the previous night, leaving sharp mineral edges at irregular angles. She was moving across it carefully, and the careful part failed, and she went down hard on one knee, one hand out, the mass taking the impact against a raised ridge of rock. The crack ran across the lower seal. Not dramatic. Catastrophic. Without a functional filtration mask, the particulate content of Dusk Nine's atmosphere would cause progressive respiratory damage. The trial documentation was clear. This was a beacon situation. This was exactly the kind of injury the beacon existed for. Solace sat on the ground with the broken mask in her hands and looked at it with the expression of someone watching something they had controlled become something they cannot. Rail sat beside her and gave her his mask. She refused. Of course she refused. It was not rational. The trial was survival, not sacrifice, and accepting a teammate's mask meant they were now the one without protection. She told him this, clearly, because it was the correct analysis. Rail said that he had been managing his filtration manually since day 3. She stared at him. She asked what that meant. He explained. The masks were the primary filtration method, but they were not the only possible method. The particulate content of Dusk 9's atmosphere followed a cycle. It spiked during the thermal transitions between day and night, and dropped in the mid-periods of each cycle. If you timed your breathing, longer, slower breaths during low particulate periods, reduced breathing during high particulate periods, and used the terrain to block the particulate wind when possible, you could manage the exposure without a mask. Not indefinitely, but for the remaining 8 days of the trial. If his calculations were correct, he would be within his body's tolerance margin. Solace said, "When did you start planning this?" Rail said, "Day 1, when I checked the particulate cycle data in the trial pack." She asked why he hadn't told anyone. He looked at her with the kind of honesty that is so simple it takes a moment to understand. He said, "I hoped I wouldn't need to use it." He had spent 3 days practicing a contingency plan for a situation that at the time had no sign of happening, and he had said nothing about it, and he had been right to have it. Sala took the mask. She put it on. She sat there a moment longer. She had been thinking of Rail Dorn as 14th in the class since intake day. She had a number beside his name in her head, and the number was 14. She was now recalculating something, but she did not know yet what it added up to, so she stood up and kept moving. That same day, in the high orbit above Dusk 9, Thurek was back at the display. He had been checking in several times a day now, which was more than he had planned on. He looked at Rail's biometric data again and noted that the stress indicators had not meaningfully changed since day 1. He looked at Sala's data, which showed a clear stress spike in the last few hours, the mask incident, though he didn't know the details yet. He looked at Bren's, which showed the sustained elevated response of an organism in an unfamiliar environment who is paying constant attention to everything around him. He looked at Rails again, still low, still calm, below training baseline. He called Hayes. She came. He pointed at the display. He said, "I want to understand this." Hayes looked at the display for a moment. Then she said something that Thurek thought about for a long time afterward. She said, "The Drethkai evolved in temperate zones with stable geology and predictable seasons. Your survival drive is real, but it is a managed reflex. It activates, it functions, it settles back. Humanity evolved on a planet that was not stable, not predictable. It was seismically active, climatically variable, full of large predators that had been refining their methods for longer than the species had been walking upright. The survival drive that developed in that context is not a reflex. It is structural. It is the frame the rest of the person is built around." Thurek said, "All humans." Hayes said, "No. Most of them live in comfortable places now, and the drive is there but quiet. But it does not go away. And when the environment calls for it, the ones who have it close to the surface, it responds the way it was built to. Not with panic, with readiness." Thurek said nothing for a moment. He looked at the quiet biometric line on the display. Then he said, "And you knew this one had it close to the surface?" Hayes said, "I suspected. The data confirms it." Thurek said, "How did you know to suspect?" She thought about it for a moment. Then she said, "The way he stood in the intake line. He was watching the room the way you watch a place you are already prepared to survive." Thurek had no response to that. He looked at the display a while longer and then left, because he had other duties, and because he found that the display, and the quiet flat line running across it, was making him feel something he had not anticipated and did not quite have a name for. It was not exactly respect. It was the feeling that comes just before respect, when you have not yet decided to feel it, but your body has already started. Dusk 9's final week had a different quality to it than the first. Not worse, exactly, though it was harder in measurable ways. It was more honest. The environment had stopped being a test and started being a fact, the way extreme situations eventually become facts instead of events. The cold was no longer a shock. The fractured ground was no longer surprising. The cadets still on the moon had made a kind of peace with their surroundings, not comfort, but acceptance, and acceptance is its own kind of strength. 4 more beacons were activated between days 8 and 12. One was a genuine medical emergency. A scale cadet with a respiratory complication that the filtration mask had partially failed to prevent. The extraction was fast and correct, and the cadet survived with treatment. 3 others activated by choice, each one a moment where the internal calculation finally resolved. The cost of continuing is greater than the cost of leaving. The Academy treated this as data, not failure. The cadets were extracted without comment and taken back to Stratum 7. That left 9 cadets on the moon for the final push. Sala's group was 3. Dur had activated his beacon on day 9, after a secondary seismic event partially collapsed the storage area where they had cached their secondary supplies. He was physically unharmed, but he came out of the rubble with shaking limbs and a look in his eyes that Sala recognized as the threshold point. She did not try to talk him out of it. She helped him locate the beacon on his pack, because his hands were not cooperating, and then she watched the extraction flare and turned back to what remained. Bryn's injured leg had settled into a stable limitation. The cracked joint casing had been sealed with the medical kit's bonding compound on day 1, and it had held, but the mobility loss was permanent for the duration of the trial. He compensated with his upper limbs and reduced his movement range and did not complain, because Orvathai in the field do not complain about physical damage any more than a piece of equipment complains about wear. He simply adjusted and continued. Bryn had been watching Rail every day and logging what he saw, and the log was now 13 entries long and growing increasingly difficult to categorize. On day 10, the Keth hound came back, but it came back differently. Bryn heard it first, because his species' hearing was tuned for pattern, and the pattern was wrong. He had cataloged the hound's territorial calls across 9 days, the deep resonant sound that marked presence and range, the sharper pulse that meant the animal was moving quickly, the low sustained frequency that Bryn had identified as resting behavior. What he heard now was none of these. It was erratic, broken. The intervals were irregular, the frequency shifting in ways that suggested the animal's control over its own signals was compromised. He reported this to Sala, who asked what it meant. Bryn said, distress. The animal is in distress. They found it at the edge of the mineral flat, 200 meters from the camp, moving low to the ground with the specific uncoordinated quality of a very capable creature operating at reduced capacity. It was large, even diminished, and the fact of its size was apparent at this distance in daylight. But it was not hunting. It was not establishing territory. It was moving in the erratic way of something that is in pain and no longer fully in control of its own intentions. Sala assessed the situation with her usual speed. The hound was compromised. That was, on one level, good. A compromised apex predator was less immediately dangerous. But a compromised apex predator dying near their camp created a different problem. The carcass would draw secondary scavengers. The Dusk 9 documentation listed 3 types of smaller scavenger species, each capable of being dangerous in groups. An animal the size of the Keth hound, decomposing in the open air near their shelter, was a beacon of a different kind. She outlined a deterrence plan, movement, noise, organized disturbance to drive the hound further from the camp before it became too weak to move. Rail said, or we help it. Sala looked at him. She said it was a predator. She said it had tried to attack the camp on day 5. Rail said it had not tried to attack. It had assessed and retreated. This was technically accurate, and Sala did not argue it, but she pressed the point about risk. The hound was large and in pain, which was the most dangerous combination for any species. Approaching it was not a controlled risk. Rail said, we have filtered water and a rough sense of what's wrong with it. The groundwater near the eastern flat has a high mineral content that's outside safe range for most of the fauna in the trial documentation. It's been drinking from there. That section of ground has the same chemical signature as the contamination flag in the trial pack's appendix. If it gets enough clean water to flush the contamination, it will recover enough to move on. We give it a reason to go somewhere else, and we solve 2 problems. Sala said, that is logical. Rail said, yes. He said it simply, and Sala accepted it, and neither of them said the other thing, which was that his voice when he proposed it had not sounded like someone making a logical argument. Bryn knew this. Bren had written 14 entries in the field log, and he knew Rail's voice for practical information and Rail's voice for other things. And this was the second kind. Rail wanted to help the animal. He had wrapped it in logic because that was the language of the group, but the origin of the impulse was not calculation. Bren thought about this while watching what happened next. Rail went to the hound alone. He told the others to hold position, not for their protection but for the animals. A group approach would read as a coordinated threat, and a threatened animal in distress was unpredictable. One person was easier for the hound to manage. One person was not a pack. He moved across the 200 meters of open flat without rushing. He did not look away from the animal. He did not do the things that instinct suggests when a large predator is in your line of sight. He did not make himself look larger. He did not vocalize. He did not show his teeth or his hands or any of the things that signal active threat to most territorial species. He simply moved at a pace that was not closing too fast and not retreating either. The pace of something that has a direction and is taking it. The Keth hound saw him from 100 meters out. Its head came up and its posture shifted, not attack posture, which Bren would have recognized and which would have meant different choices, but the alert posture of a compromised creature trying to assess a new variable. It watched Rail come. At 40 meters, Rail crouched down and set the water container on the ground. He had decanted filtered water from the group's supply into the smaller personal container. He set it down, stood back up, and moved 5 meters to the right, opening a clear path to the container. The hound did not move for a long time. Rail stood and waited. He was not impatient. He was not nervous. Or if he was, there was nothing in his body that said so. He stood in the cold, flat air of dusk 9 and waited the way the planet waited, without urgency, without requirement. The hound moved toward the container. Slowly, it flinched once, a muscle spasm from the contamination, and its head came up again, and it looked at Rail. Rail did not react. The hound looked at him for a long moment. Then it lowered its head and drank. It snapped at him once, midway through, a reflex action and nothing more. The sharp sideways motion of a head that is used to defending its resources and operates on that memory, even in a compromised state. The snap came within a distance that should have produced a flinch. Rail did not flinch. He waited for the movement to pass, and then he was still again. By day 11 the hound was gone. They did not see it leave. It was simply absent from the range of Bren's audio monitoring, and then later from the wider radius he checked, and then from everything. It had moved on. Bren's 15th field log entry was the longest of them all. He wrote it that night in the shelter while Sala and Rail slept. He wrote it carefully because he felt it needed to be careful, as if the right words were the ones that would make what he had observed make sense, and he did not want to use the wrong ones and lose it. He wrote, "I have been trying to understand what Rail Dorn is doing throughout this trial, and I have been framing it incorrectly. I have been looking for the pattern in his actions, what he does in a crisis, how he performs under stress. But performance is not the correct frame. He is not performing. When he went into the fissure, he was not trying to score well. When he faced the hound on night 5, he was not demonstrating anything. When he gave Sala his mask, there was no audience in his intention. And when he helped the hound today, it was not strategy first. It was care first, and he made it strategy so the group could follow the logic. He helped a predator that had threatened them because it was in pain, and he could help it, and those two facts were enough." He paused, and then wrote, "I have studied survival science for 4 years. I have read the frameworks and the classifications and the tier systems that describe how species respond under pressure. I do not have a classification for this. Not for someone who is simultaneously the most pragmatic person in the group and the one most likely to do something that has no pragmatic justification. I think those two things come from the same place in him. I think they are both the same thing, expressed differently depending on what the situation asks for." He put down the stylus and looked at the shelter ceiling. Outside, the night temperature was at its lowest point of the trial, the orbital mechanics of Dusk 9 having brought the moon to the furthest point in its swing from the gas giant's thermal influence. It was so cold that the mineral formations were cracking at their edges, small sharp sounds in the darkness. Rail's breathing in sleep was slow and even. Sala's was the same. Bren listened to them both and felt something he did not immediately recognize. It took him a moment to identify it as the feeling of being glad of the specific company he was in. The final days were hard in the way of things that are simply hard. The group ate from reduced supplies with the discipline of people who know the end is calculable and the calculation is survivable. Sala ran the numbers 3 times a day because that was how she managed uncertainty, and the numbers always came out the same. They would make it. She told them the results each time, not because they needed reassurance, but because she believed in shared information. By day 13, she had stopped calculating before moving and started asking Rail what he thought first. She did not announce this change. She simply did it, and Rail responded to it in the same way he responded to everything, by being useful and not making anything of it. On the morning of day 14, the extraction shuttle appeared in the sky over the eastern flat. It was a small shape at first, catching the flat pale light of Dusk 9's day cycle, growing until it was large and real, and landing in the open ground with the careful precision of a pilot who had been told about the seismic instability. 3 cadets walked out to meet it. Sala, moving with the precision of someone who has completed what she set out to complete. Bren, with a careful gait around the damaged joint casing, data log in hand, 16 entries recorded. Rail, carrying the group's pack, because he had been carrying it for the last 3 days, since Bren's mobility made it difficult and Sala's additional supply weight from taking his filtration role made the distribution uneven. He handed the pack to the shuttle technician and waited for Sala and Bren to board first. The technician, a young Drethkai on his first trial season posting, looked at the 3 of them and then at the 14-day environmental report that had already come through on his panel. He looked at Rail for a moment, the way you look at something you expected to be smaller than it turned out to be. Rail nodded at him and went inside. In the shuttle cabin, Bren watched Rail sit down and look out the small viewport at the surface of Dusk 9 as it fell away below them. Rail looked at the moon with the same expression he had used to look at the trial documentation back at the Academy on intake day 7 months ago, taking it in, noting it, giving it the respect of full attention. Bren closed his field log. He did not write a final entry yet. He wanted to wait until he was back on Stratum 7, back in the context of structure and classification and the clear cold light of the Academy's assessment systems, before he wrote the last thing he needed to write about what he had seen on Dusk 9. He had a feeling it was going to be the most important entry, and he wanted the right words for it. The results were posted on a standard Academy results board, in the standard format, with the standard columns: cadet name, species, trial score, overall rank. The board was accessible from any terminal in the Academy, and most cadets checked it within an hour of the shuttle docking. Some checked it before they had changed out of their trial gear. Sala first, by a clear margin. Her leadership record, group survival rate, documented decision-making under pressure, and the quality of her post-trial report combined into a score the assessment board described as the highest in 6 years. It was deserved in the plain, unfussy way that things which are genuinely earned tend to be deserved. She read the number beside her name and sat very still for a moment, and then she allowed herself one small exhale and went to find a meal, because she had not eaten a full meal in 14 days, and the number could wait. Bren, second. His analytical field log was, according to the assessment board's formal notation, one of the finest observational documents submitted by a trial cadet in the Academy's recent history. They used the word rigorous. They used the word significant. They appended a recommendation that the log be archived in the academic record as a reference document for future training programs. Bren read this and felt something that would have looked, to most species, like nothing, but which was, for an Orvithai, the equivalent of a long and deeply felt moment of quiet pride. Then he looked at the 4th name on the list. Rail Dorn. 4th. Not first. Not last. Not even in the top 3. 4th. The Academy's scoring methodology was detailed and well-reasoned, and it rewarded what it was designed to reward: demonstrable leadership positions, recorded decision-making chains, quantified performance outcomes, data logged observations. Rail had led nothing officially. He had no leadership notation in his record because at no point during the trial had he been assigned or assumed a formal leadership role. His decision-making was not recorded because he had not recorded it. He kept a basic resource log, utilitarian and brief, nothing like the analytical document Bren had submitted. His performance outcomes were real, but not dramatic. He had survived. He had helped the group survive. The scoring system looked at his record and found a capable cadet who had performed solidly in a supporting role. 4th. Bren looked at the number for a long time. Then he opened his data log, wrote the final entry he had been holding since the shuttle ride, and submitted it not as a post-trial appendix to his academic report, but as a separate document, addressed directly to the Academy's assessment board, with a copy to Commander Hayes. He wrote, "The standard metrics do not contain a column for what Rail Dorn did on Dusk 9. I submit this observation not as a complaint about the scoring outcome, but as a genuine inquiry into whether the Academy's assessment framework is currently capable of measuring what I believe I observed. A cadet who identifies a contingency failure 3 days before it occurs and prepares silently for it. A cadet who stares down an apex predator with a stone and a willingness to stand his ground that the predator, with all its biological capacity for threat assessment, found sufficient reason to retreat. A cadet whose physiological stress response in a Class 4 hostile environment ran below his baseline at a training facility. I am aware that these facts individually can be explained. I am not certain they can be explained together without concluding that we are measuring something, but not the thing we think we are measuring." He sent the document and went to find food, and the document went up through the system and arrived, among other places, on the desk of Admiral Thurek. Thurek was already in Commander Hayes' office when the message arrived. He had not planned to visit her office. He had found himself walking toward it after reviewing the final trial results, for reasons he had not clearly articulated to himself, and she had opened the door before he knocked, which meant either she had been expecting him or she always answered doors early, and he had been around her long enough to know it was the first one. He sat down. He had the final results on his tablet, and he placed it on her desk with Rail's entry facing up. He said, "Fourth." Hayes looked at the tablet. She said, "Yes." He said, "I watched that human for 14 days. I watched his biometric data run flat, while every other cadet's climbed. I watched him face the Keth Hound, and I read Bren's report about it. I read the report about the filtration mask. I read his resource log. He rationed for the full 14 days from day 1, not day 3 when the situation became critical, from day 1, before there was any indication of a shortage. And the scoring system gave him 4th place." Hayes said, "The scoring system measured what it was designed to measure." Thurek said, "Was he the most dangerous student?" The office was quiet. Outside the viewport, the station's outer ring was visible in the slow rotation that maintained its gravity, and beyond it the planet Duvrin 9 filled the bottom third of the view, enormous and indifferent. Hayes said, "Sala is an exceptional officer. She will be a commander worth having. Bren is a better analyst than most professionals I have worked with twice his age. Both of those things are completely true." Thurek said, "That is not what I asked." Hayes was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The Drethkai evolved in stable, tempered environments. Your survival drive is real and it functions. But it is a managed mechanism. It turns on when it is needed and it turns off when it is not. Rail Dorn's does not turn off. It does not turn on either, because it was never not running. Humans from his world, his background, the ones who came from the kind of place that forged the nervous system he is operating with, they do not experience survival as a state they enter and exit. It is the ground under everything else they do. The classroom work, the polite conversation, the quiet meals, and the careful questions, and the unremarkable middle of the class scores. All of that is happening on top of a foundation that is always, at every moment, reading the room, cataloging the risks, running contingency plans, and staying very still because staying still costs nothing and calling attention to yourself sometimes costs everything." Thurek said, "You are describing something that sounds like a condition." Hayes said, "I am describing a person. A young man who grew up on a world that humans have only partially made safe, and who carries that world inside him the way you carry your species' history. The Drethkai built structures and calendars and managed environments, and that is what your history gave your nervous system. Humanity built those things too, eventually, but they built them on top of something else, something older, and the older thing does not go away." Thurek looked at the tablet. He looked at the number 4. He said, "And the Academy's trial did not capture this." Hayes said, "The trial found it. The scoring system didn't have a column for it." She looked at him directly, and in the particular way that she had of saying the most important thing without raising her voice. The trial tested survival instincts. It found them, in Sala, and in Bren, and in every cadet who came back off that moon. But it found something in Rail Dorn that I am not sure the Academy has ever had a name for. because the last time anyone was measuring survival the way he practices it, nobody was writing the results down. They were just surviving. The conversation ended the way Hayes' conversations tended to end, with the other person having more to think about than when they arrived. Thurek left. He walked back through the station's corridors with the specific quality of thought that comes when a framework you have trusted for a long time has been shown to have a gap in it. Not broken, not wrong, incomplete. There is a particular kind of discomfort in that realization, and Thurek was a precise enough thinker to sit with the discomfort rather than push it away. Vorin, in his planning office 2 levels above, was having a similar experience in a different register. He had the full trial data on his desk. He had Bryn's field log open beside his own assessment notes. He had been sitting with them for 2 hours. He was a methodical being, and methodical beings do not enjoy discovering that their methodology has missed something. He did not enjoy it now, but he was also, at his core, committed to the accuracy of the thing he built, which meant he could not simply decide the gap was not there. He opened the planning document for next year's trial. The format was the same as every year: the environmental selection, the hazard parameters, the assessment columns, the scoring weights. He looked at the assessment columns for a long time. Then he created a new entry at the bottom of the list. He did not title it yet because he did not have the right words, and Vorin did not name things until he had the right words. He left it blank, and he stared at it. The blank space where the title should be was going to take some thought. He was still working on it. On the Academy's observation level, in the long curved bay where the station's outer viewports faced the open space above Duvrin 9, Rail Dorn stood alone and looked at Dusk 9. The moon was visible from here on the right approach, a small pale shape in the distance, unremarkable from this far up, just another rock in orbit. He had been standing there for about 20 minutes when he heard footsteps behind him. Sala came to stand beside him. She looked at what he was looking at. She recognized the moon after a moment and said nothing about it, because she had looked at it already, from her own quarters, and she had felt about it what she expected to feel and had moved on. She was not sure what Rail felt about it. She was not sure he would tell her if she asked. But she stood beside him anyway, because something in the last 14 days had changed the specific weight of that company, and it was worth standing in. After a while she said, "I never asked you." He waited. She said, "The Fisher, the Mask, the Hound. Why did you do all of it? You didn't have to. It wasn't in the trial metrics. It didn't add to your score." Rail thought about this, not because the answer was complicated, but because Sala had asked it seriously, and serious questions deserve honest thought, even when the answer is simple. He said, "Someone had to." Sala looked at the moon. She was quiet for a while, and then she nodded, slowly, the way you nod when something clicks into place that you had been half understanding for a long time. Not because the answer was surprising, because it was the only answer that had ever been true, and it was strange and clarifying to hear it said so plainly. They stood there a while longer. The planet below turned slowly. The station moved through its orbit with the patience of large objects in space. Dusk 9 made its small pale circle in the distance, holding its cold and its cracked planes and its mineral silence completely, without concern for the creatures who had recently spent 14 days inside it and survived. Rail looked at it without any particular expression. He was not proud of himself, or at least not in a way that needed to be seen. He was not telling himself a story about what he had done. He was just a person who had been in a hard place and had handled it the way he handled hard places, because that was what you did, and that was what he was built for, and there was nothing more to say about it than that. He looked at the moon for a while longer. Then he turned and went to find something to eat, because he was hungry and the trial was over and dinner was a real and immediate thing, and Rail Dorn had always been better at dealing with what was real and immediate than with anything else. Behind him, Sala stood a moment longer at the viewport. She looked at the small pale moon and thought about a person who had walked into a fissure without hesitation, who had stared down a predator with a rock and a quiet pair of eyes, who had given away his own protection without fanfare and spent 3 days breathing carefully around a problem no one else had seen coming. She thought about the number 4 beside his name on the results board. Then she turned and followed him down the corridor, and the question she was thinking about, the one about what exactly the scores were measuring and what they were missing, she kept it and carried it with her, because it seemed like the kind of question that deserved to be kept. It was, she suspected, The kind of question that did not have an answer yet. But somewhere in a planning office 2 levels above her, someone was making space for it. And that, for now, was a start.